Meanwhile, the big story, U.S.-China tensions reaching a boiling point now. The Trump administration is planning to cancel visas for thousands of Chinese graduate students who have ties to universities that are associated with the Chinese military, according to the New York Times this morning. Beijing approved measures earlier today that could undermine Hong Kong's freedoms and Western ideals, making it fully part of China. The State Department making it clear yesterday that the territory is no longer autonomous from China, even going so far as to say that China is modeling Hong Kong after itself. Joining me right now is the State Department spokesperson, Morgan Ortagus. And Morgan, it is great to see you once again. Thanks so much for being here.
Great to be back. Thanks for having me, Maria.
Well, this is pretty serious stuff, Morgan. Let's talk about the implications in Hong Kong and what the Secretary is saying when he says that Hong Kong is no longer autonomous. What are the implications of that statement, Morgan?
Thanks, Maria. So we are required, the State Department is required by law to certify to Congress the autonomy in Hong Kong. And essentially what that means is in 1997, the Chinese Communist Party committed to Hong Kong and to the world that Hong Kong would remain autonomous and that they would be independent of the Chinese Communist Party. So since last March, when we last certified to Congress, we have seen a number of things happen, beginning with an extradition law. Then you saw many protests of this extradition law where Hong Kongers could be subject to arbitrarily going back to the mainland for any sort of prosecution. And then we saw a really violent crackdown of these protests. And this has been boiling for over a year. And the hallmark of the foreign policy of this administration, Maria, is to recognize reality around the world. So Secretary Pompeo, in good conscience, could not go to the Congress and to certify that Hong Kong is still autonomous, especially because, as we saw overnight, the National People's Congress has passed what they call the national security legislation, which is essentially a Chinese Communist Party takeover of Hong Kong.
You know, it's interesting what has taken place here, because I think the entrance of China into the WTO was something done in good faith on the belief that maybe China would see democracy elsewhere and say, well, you know what, we like democracy, and yeah, this would be good for our people, and capitalism is okay, even though we are communists. But, Morgan, that didn't happen. In fact, they've gone hardline, the complete opposite. So they've really disappointed those that were encouraging the WTO inclusion. Isn't that right?
You're right, Maria. This is the third administration I've worked in. I've worked for Democrat and Republican presidents. And I can tell you that until this administration, both parties got it wrong for almost 40 years. And it's not for lack of trying. I think it made sense to try to bring China into the WTO at the time. But what we have seen is what we had hoped would happen, is that when they did business with capitalist societies, that they would open up, that they would come more free. But under General Secretary Xi, that has not happened in China. In fact, we see that they're being more belligerent around the world. And what's crucial today, Maria, is for democracies and freedom-loving people around the world. This is a moment in history where people have to stand up and stand on one side of history. You can no longer, especially after COVID-19, you can no longer ignore the actions of the Chinese Communist Party in Hong Kong. You can't look away. And again, the Trump administration, we're basing our foreign policy as we see the world for the reality that it is, not as we hope that the world will be.
Yeah, and, you know, we had Jimmy Lai on this week, live from Hong Kong. He said the situation is getting real dangerous on the ground. Business leaders, I think, are little by little getting it in terms of the threat to national security that China represents. But the president of the U.S.China Business Council is urging all sides to de-escalate, maintain the one country, two systems model that has been in place since the territory was handed over to China in 1997. So, Morgan, will the U.S. target individuals of the Chinese government so that the people of Hong Kong do not bear the brunt of any American action? What's the next move here? And what I was really looking for when I said to you, what's the significance of, you know, the autonomy statement by the secretary, is what kind of liberties does Hong Kong have now that it may very well not be able to enjoy, given the Secretary of State's, pronouncement that there's no more autonomy?
Sure. So this is step one. We had to certify to the Congress whether we still believe that Hong Kong was autonomous or not. We have clearly making the step to say that we cannot certify that it remains autonomous. I don't want to get ahead of the president. He has a lot of options on the table, many of which that you have mentioned this morning. But in reference back to the person that you mentioned, I think from the U.S.-China Business Council, we agree that China should be respecting the two systems, the way that it was supposed to be set up in 1997 under the Basic Law. We can no longer certify this. So the media doesn't need to look at the discussion, in my opinion, about necessarily de-escalating from the end of the United States. It is China, it is the Chinese Communist Party that has arbitrarily arrested people like Jimmy Lai, pro-democracy protesters that have instituted laws that have gone around the judicial independence and the autonomy of Hong Kong's body of lawmakers. And of course, what we're seeing, it's important for your viewers to know, the legislation passed overnight in the National People's Congress in China essentially calls these freedom-loving protesters terrorists. They're using national security in order to justify violent crackdowns on democracy. And so I think we'll see what President Trump, and of course the Congress, has many options. I don't want to get in front of any announcements, so we'll see what they have to say today.
So real quick before you go, I know it's very difficult to differentiate who's working for the Communist Party and who's actually just studying here in an honest way to progress. But what about this bill from Tom Cotton that says you want to limit visas? And what about the New York Times report today that the president will pull visas of anybody who has ties to the Chinese military, student visas, Morgan?
Yep. So we don't have any announcements to make from the State Department on that. But what I will tell you is what we've looked closely at the past year is just as you said, is scrutinizing the visa process for entry into the United States. One of the things that we have done, for example, is that we looked at these quote unquote journalists, quote unquote media companies. These are really Chinese state propaganda outlets in the United States. And we have taken action there to decrease their numbers significantly. We're not going to allow, you know, a complete propaganda outlet to operate freely here. We believe in operating with China on the principle of sovereignty and of mutual respect. But unfortunately, we're not seeing that. And we got to say there's a big difference between a complete propaganda outlet like the Global Times and the Wall Street Journal, for example. And so State Department has taken a number of actions related to that over the past year.
That's right. They threw out the real journalists out of China, and they gave us the spies. Morgan, it's great to see you this morning, and we appreciate your insights on this very important topic. We'll see you soon. Morgan Ortagus, more Mornings with Maria right after this.